Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. My guest for this show is Patricia Cummings. She is with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. She's the Supervisor of Conviction Integrity and the Special Investigations Unit. She's a past defense lawyer, prosecutor. She was a lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin School of Law. And she's just recently had a very exciting case that she won after 2 years. So welcome very much to the show.
Thank you. Very nice to be here, Rob.
And I just want to mention that we met where you were a speaker. We were both speakers at the Peace and Justice Studies Conference earlier this year. And so I was really interested in what you had to say. And you were talking pretty much about the new rules kind of for Philadelphia that Larry Krassner has brought. You were recruited from Texas to come and to do your job. And so give us a kind of an overview of how things have changed in Philadelphia for starters.
If I could, Rob, let me back up a little bit. And I want to say that it was a pleasure meeting you at Arcadia. And I loved being there, but I was actually being there as a fill-in for Larry Krassner. The point of the lecture or panel discussion was to talk about the various different reforms that are taking place in Philadelphia, and it was to do it from the standpoint of various different stakeholders in the system. So it was a fascinating discussion. What we tried to do then was just talk about criminal justice reform and what it means to Philadelphia. And at that time, I was still kind of trying to think of the best word to describe it, but really trying to come to grips with the differences between the world that I existed in for so long as a lawyer in Texas versus what I'm seeing in Philadelphia. And now as I sit here with you today, a few months have passed by, so I think I'm probably in a little better position than I was then, because it's a constant learning process. And I will say, I'm not sure if you recall this particular point that I made. It was interesting to me when we were talking about criminal justice reform, because oftentimes various people that engage in the discussion talk about it from the perspective of whether or not it's a partisan issue or not. And that is particularly relevant given just the climate of Philadelphia. As I enter discussions like that, I always say, you know, coming from where I came from in Texas, I'm not so sure it's as partisan as people say. And that's particularly meaningful today, just when we see what happened nationally in terms of the criminal justice reform bill that was voted out of the Senate. So it's funny, I get to say that again today, and I get to say it, I think, maybe with a little bit more authority, because I'm not just relying on Texas when I make that statement, but now we can see, at least hopefully we're going to see some real positive improvements in the criminal justice system on a federal level. And as what a lot of commentators were saying about that, the hopes are that various states will kind of line up to do some of the things that I think we're going to see happening in the federal system soon. I kind of jumped off from your question. So sorry.
That's okay. Well, you got me going. So yeah, this hasn't even passed in the House yet, right? But how's it look? Does it look like it's going to really make a difference?
I think it'll make a difference. And I just referenced, there was some commentary on it last night and this morning where some people are saying, don't get too far ahead of yourself, because when you're talking about the federal reform, you're talking about the minority of criminal defendants that are incarcerated or suffering consequences as a result of it. But I think it's very important to put that in the context of a lot of states, particularly state legislatures, when they see that it can be done at a federal level, I think are going to say we can do it at a state level too. And I really hope we see some of that happening in Pennsylvania.
So it kind of gives them the guts to take on issues that might be uncomfortable normally.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit more of, this doesn't have to be a liberal progressive ideal. It is something that makes sense from a conservative aspect as well as a liberal aspect.
Yeah, I think even the Koch brothers were supporting this.
Yep, I think the Koch brothers have supported a lot of criminal justice reform on the statewide level as well as the national level.
No.
It's interesting.
Even a broken clock is right sometimes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, But tell me about how things have changed under Larry Krassner, and what's your role in it, and give me an idea of how Philadelphia has changed.
So, always I will start an answer to a question with a few caveats. One is, you can't look to me as the expert as to how Philadelphia has changed when I've lived in Texas most of my life. So you have to take what I say for what it's worth. In addition to that caveat, I think it's also important to say when you're measuring change, it's hard to do it on such a short-term level, right? So Larry Krassner was elected and sworn in January. I mean, he took his first day in the office in early January of this year. So we haven't quite had a year for everybody to get an idea of what Larry's progressive reform was all about and how, in fact, it is going to work out not only in the criminal justice system itself, but also in the community of Philadelphia. So with those two caveats, I will say that it appears that he is doing great things in terms of trying to change what I think more and more people on a national level are seeing are problems with the criminal justice system. And so I will say you've got on one end of the spectrum, you've got the bail reform, which I think we can say empirically we're seeing vast improvements over the way things were done in the past, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is what I do, which is the conviction integrity work, which is, so what happens when we've got a case that has gone through the system and there are allegations that it wasn't handled properly. Specifically, the legal language that we use is whether or not the conviction is in fact a wrongful conviction, i.e. was there a due process violation, and is there a possibility that we might have somebody who's actually innocent that's been incarcerated. So bail reform to conviction integrity reform, and to me, from my vantage point at this point, it's huge strides in effectuating change, and then that's not even mentioning all the stuff in between.
What kind of huge strides?
So let me kind of speak specifically from my vantage point. Philadelphia had a conviction integrity unit before I entered the scene. It was actually referred to as the conviction review unit. And for most people that knew anything about it, I think that they would say it tended to be a unit that might have been a unit in name only. John Hallway, who works at the Quattrone Center, who's actually studied conviction integrity units, has said that there appears to be two types of units throughout the country. Now we're upwards of about 40 of them. And one is the real unit who actually spends the time taking cases through a pretty wide funnel. In other words, looking at a lot of cases and then investigating them to figure out if in fact something went wrong. That's the real conviction integrity unit. On the other hand, John Hallway refers to what he calls a CRINO. And CRINO stands for Conviction Review in Name Only. Mm-hmm. And that is just the reality of how politically savvy some elected district attorneys have been throughout the country to say, look, we understand as a nation we're talking about wrongful convictions and how actually innocent people get convicted. And so we get it. It's part of our culture now, and we should be doing something about it. And so some district attorneys have said, okay, I'm going to create the unit, but they do it, so to speak, in name only, where there's not really a deep commitment to looking at the cases, investigating them, and actually trying to figure out if, in fact, the system made a mistake and we need to correct something that is a big wrong. I mean, I think we all agree as a society, one of the worst things our criminal justice system can do is convict the innocent. And so in Philadelphia in particular, I think that there was a lot of criticism that the unit that existed before Larry Krassner was elected was that CRINO, Conviction Review in Name Only. I'm not going to say that my personal opinion is that it was absolutely, because the reality is if you study it at all, you will see that the unit did indeed have a few exonerations. And so to speak, when you look at that and you compare it with some other units, there's some other units that haven't had any. I've learned a lot since I've been in Philadelphia that the yardstick for measuring the success of a unit depends so much on so many factors.
What are some of the factors?
You of course have got to have your commitment from the district attorney, and whether or not it is window dressing or whether or not the district attorney actually believes that these types of wrongs have occurred, and that we as prosecutors have a legal duty as well as an ethical duty to actually do something about it. So that is super important. Do you have the commitment? Another factor is, do you have the resources? Sometimes you're going to see that a unit may exist and you've got the commitment from the elected, but there's not a lot of resources. One thing that I am very proud of has been Larry Krassner's commitment and dedication to the idea that this work is a necessary part of a district attorney's office, and he's done that by making sure that the resources exist to get the work done.
So that means money, right?
Absolutely.
So what percentage of the DA's budget is apportioned to that? Do you know?
I can't tell you the percentage. I could probably ask somebody who's in the room that might know, but I will say this. I do know very early on after Larry was elected, a lot of time and energy was spent dealing with the folks that make the decisions about budgeting. And I know high on Larry's agenda was, give me enough resources so we can have a robust unit who's able to do their work. And I don't know the particulars, but I do know it was successful, and that Larry has made promises, I think, to the community of Philadelphia, as well as to me in regard to, hey, Patricia, I'm going to give you the tools that you need.
Now, you were doing something like this in Dallas, right?
Yes, I was.
So he recruited you to leave the place you've lived for 20-some years to come to Philly.
Yeah, and I will say,
attractive offer.
Yeah, so I have to be a lawyer for a minute and be very careful with the way you raise that question. I was in Dallas. I ran the Conviction Integrity Unit, but I actually left that position and was doing work in Austin when Larry offered me the job. So I don't want to make it seem like I left a Conviction Integrity Unit in Dallas to come straight to Philadelphia. I'd already made that decision because the elected district attorney that had hired me had resigned. So I had a little bit of lag time in between, and what I did in between my work in Dallas and coming to Philadelphia was a lot of legislative work in this field, and also I did some work with the Innocence Project of Texas and New York.
Cool. Very cool. So you were listing factors for success: DA support, giving adequate resources. What are some other ones?
I'm glad you went back to that, because I think the other ones that I have not talked about are somewhat as important, and you can't have a complete discussion without talking about all of them. And some of them are going to be kind of practical factors, and then others are going to be legal factors. And what I mean by the practical factors is, when you are asked to look at a case, your ability to really take a hard look at that case is going to depend on, do you still have the files? That's a good beginning. Sometimes we're asked to look at cases that are almost 40 or 50 years old. Wow. And so there are real questions about what is left to look at. In addition to, do you have the physical files, there's also always the question of, do you have the physical evidence? Is there any biological material that still exists that may allow for DNA testing, for example, if we really wanted to figure out if a defendant's claim of actual innocence has any merit? So you deal with all of that, and it's interesting because now I have kind of the perspective of going from one jurisdiction to a totally different jurisdiction. I've really appreciated the differences in how local jurisdictions kind of manage their files and their evidence. One thing that is particularly interesting to me is I compare Philadelphia with Dallas, and I don't know if you've read a lot about Dallas, but one thing that was amazing and enabled Dallas to do as much as it did in terms of exonerations is Dallas had a lab, and the lab kept all of its biological evidence. So Dallas, when they had the wherewithal to actually go back and look at cases to determine if we'd gotten it right or wrong, they had the ability to call up the lab and say, do you still have X, Y, or Z from that 1978 murder conviction? Wow. And can we test it? And so because of that, Dallas actually, I believe, still leads the country in terms of the number of exonerations that have occurred as a result of DNA testing.
What kind of numbers are we talking about? And we'll get back to the other factors, but you talk about wrongful convictions and exonerations. Is there a percentage that we can guesstimate what it is nationwide at the state level, federal level, city level? What percentage of convictions are wrongful convictions? What's the percentage of exonerations?
So you're asking me a whole lot in that question. So let me start by saying, so that I don't give any of your audience bad statistics. If anybody's interested in this topic, probably one of the best resources that we have nationally is a website that you can go to for the National Registry of Exonerations. That's a pretty remarkable website because you're going to find just about anything you want to know about what our country has done in terms of not only figuring out how many exonerations have occurred, but trying to understand why the wrongful conviction occurred in the first place. What have we learned in terms of the contributing factors in that regard, and then how we could then use that information to try to prevent them from reoccurring. On that website, what you'll also see is a pretty good breakdown that gives you the numbers based on exonerations that occurred as a result of DNA, and then also exonerations in general that didn't have to do with DNA. The reason why that's important when you're talking about numbers is at least I think there's pretty much a consensus if you have a conversation with anybody about wrongful convictions and exonerations. When you look at the DNA ones, those are very, very hard to argue about. A lot of people say they're the unassailable, we got the wrong person. And so the numbers of the DNA exonerations are probably somewhere in the vicinity of 300 and something, and I don't want to tell you a number and get it wrong, so I would just suggest looking at the website. On the other hand,
that's nationwide?
Nationwide, right. And to kind of get back to what I was saying about Dallas's DNA exonerations are in the upper 20s, and so they've got a big chunk of that 300 and something DNA exonerations. Then if you just want to talk about exonerations in general, where it's not tied to the DNA, we're in, I want to say we're over 2,000 and something, and I'm going to ask Dylan, who's sitting here next to me, to Google it, and he can tell me the exact number, and I'll come back to you with it. That wasn't the only part of the question, though, I think that I need to address. I think if I understood your question correctly, you were also just asking about statistics in the sense of, do we know how many, and you didn't say this exactly, but I think what you're saying is, do we know how many actually innocent people could be sitting in prison?
Yeah, what's the percentage of wrongful convictions?
Well, so I don't think there's anybody who's able to say that. I think all you can do is you can take the number of cases and particularly pay close attention to the DNA exonerations as well as the bigger number, and then try to extrapolate what does that mean in terms of how many we think might be there. Because keep in mind, what you've got is you've got very different approaches, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, in terms of how do you go about finding whether or not somebody was wrongfully convicted. How do you go about finding whether or not that wrongful conviction was really based on convicting an innocent person? So since you've got all these different approaches, it's really hard to be able to say, how much do we think we have as a country? How many people are sitting in prison today that didn't commit the crime?
And you were talking, you just said there are about 2,000 exonerations over what time period?
So I tell you, Dylan just pulled it up for me. I was pretty close. It's 2,359. And that's since we started actually studying it. I want to say it's 1989, and I'm going from my memory, but Dylan's going to look at the website to make sure I'm giving you something in the ballpark.
1989.
That's we've been keeping records on it, I think. We'll come back. I was right on that.
While Dylan's Googling, maybe you can check out how many convictions there were in that time. I mean, it's got to be millions, right?
Yeah. I don't know that they have that number. I would be very surprised if they did.
So you're basically talking 1 out of 1,000, maybe.
It's a lot of people will say some people will say a very insignificant number, and some people would say one is too many.
If you're the one in jail or a family member of the one in jail, right. Absolutely.
And what about the victim of the crime or the victim's family that believed that they had the right person for 25 or 30 years, and then they find out they didn't, and then it gets even worse. They find out not only did we not have the right person in custody, but the real perpetrator was out committing other crimes against other people. I think oftentimes people don't really understand the ripple effect of what it means to us from a criminal justice standpoint, but just from a society standpoint. And one more thing to note about the DNA exonerations, there's a high number of those DNA exonerations where the work that the community of criminal justice, I'm going to say reformers, has done is they've been able to go back in those cases and actually arrest and prosecute the real perpetrator. So it's pretty amazing work that's happened.
So when they do the DNA evidence, they actually can find who the real perpetrator is as part of this exoneration process.
Absolutely, and that has happened in more cases than you would expect.
That's great. That's really good. So I think it's time to do a show ID. So this is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. You already heard that if you're watching this on YouTube. And for the radio show, I just pause and then I'll paste in a bumper. Okay, so we're just going to pause for a moment.
Good time for me to cough.
Yeah. My guest for the show is Patricia Cummings. She's an attorney, and she works with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office as the Conviction Integrity and Special Investigator Unit Supervisor. And you just had a nice victory that you just found out about today. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? I want to make sure that we get that in there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a heck of a victory. It's a case that I worked on in Dallas when I ran the Conviction Integrity Unit there. And boy, it was a case that I couldn't even begin to tell you the amount of time and energy that we put in it. But essentially, a short factual summary, and then I'll tell you why it's such a big victory. A short factual summary was we, in my unit, myself and another prosecutor, we received a request to look into a claim of actual innocence. And the claim was from a man by the name of Mark Cheney, who had been convicted of a homicide back in 1986, 1987. And he was sentenced to serve life in prison. At the time we started looking at the case, he'd been in about a quarter of a century. And what was particularly interesting and what got our attention right off the bat was it appeared that the basis for the conviction against Mr. Cheney was bite mark evidence. And Rob, I don't know if you've followed any of the stories, but bite mark evidence has been a big issue as far as the criminal justice system and how we rely on scientific evidence to convict people. Bite mark evidence has been called into question by many people, and if you look at the number of exonerations that we've had in our country, you will see that there are several of them that have been based on bite mark evidence. So this case, as I said, it appeared that the conviction was based on a forensic odontologist who said that the injury on one of the victims was a human bite mark, and that forensic odontologist said that he was able to, with a scientific certainty, compare that bite mark on the victim's arm with the mouth and the teeth, the dentition of the defendant, and say that it was a match, that the defendant is the person that left that mark on the victim's body, so therefore he must have been the killer. This forensic odontologist said that with such certainty. He said that the science allowed him to say that it was a 1 in a million chance that that bite mark could have been left by anybody other than Mr. Cheney. Yeah, I see the look on your face. I think most people, when they hear that, they would say, what? That's what was used.
I'm thinking science. I mean, is there really science that goes into that?
No, I think that's what we've learned. And so that is what called us to look closely at that case. And as we did, we realized, as is often the case when you look at wrongful convictions, is when something goes wrong in one area, oftentimes there's several other things that went wrong as well. So in addition to the bad science, there were Brady violations where exculpatory and impeaching information had not been turned over by the prosecutor to
Brady violation is failure to provide evidence to the defense?
it's not just failure to provide evidence, it's failure to provide exculpatory evidence. That's kind of the magical word that the United States Supreme Court gave us 50 years ago when they decided Brady versus Maryland.
And what's exculpatory mean?
Exculpatory is, I'm going to tell you in layman's terms, it's something that says, hey, maybe that guy didn't do it. The defendant that you're trying didn't do it. Anything that could help the defendant or be seen as favorable in terms of whatever his defense is in the case.
So they used a lousy expert who exaggerated, and they didn't give the defense all of the evidence that they should have.
Right. And then, as we looked at it, it was even more than that. It was that there was information in the file that, had it been properly investigated, instead of getting caught up on the bite mark and closing the files, if it had been investigated, I think that they could have caught the real killers. Our investigation in the Dallas Conviction Integrity Unit actually led us to who we believed were the real killers.
Wow.
So that's the short thumbnail. And essentially what happened is we agreed in a trial court in Dallas that the defendant had been wrongfully convicted and that he was actually innocent. The trial court agreed with us, but the way the criminal justice system is set up in Texas is the high court in Texas, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, has to then review the case, and then they have the right to decide whether or not we were all right or wrong. It took about 2.5 years, but they issued their opinion today, and they said we were right. And they declared Mr. Cheney actually innocent. And it's huge. It's huge.
What makes this huge now?
Gosh, don't let me get emotional when I try to answer that question.
Be emotional. Emotional is great.
Huge on a personal level, and it's huge on a professional level. On the personal, let me kind of intertwine the two. In Dallas, when we were working this case, despite Dallas being at the forefront of this kind of work, there were still plenty of people in the office, prosecutors, who were naysayers about believing in whether or not this work belongs in an office, like a district attorney's office, and whether or not there truly are innocent people in prison. So it was a battle with the naysayers within my own office as to whether or not Mr. Cheney had been wrongfully convicted and whether or not he was innocent. And so I got to tell you, personally and professionally, when you have the high court in Texas say, you guys were right, there's great satisfaction in that. Personally and professionally, I'll tell you, it is good for everybody, whether you're talking about a criminal justice system or society, when we have the ability to look back and say, we got it wrong. Not only do we can never give Mr. Cheney back the 25 years that he lost. We can never adequately deal with what that caused to the victims' families, but we certainly can do something by recognizing it, and then it's only when we do that that we can learn how to try to prevent it from reoccurring. So yeah, it's just huge.
Are there any kind of repercussions that'll happen for other states?
Repercussions. If you're asking me just in the context of this particular opinion out of Texas today, what I hope is, I hope other states will pay attention to it, because a lot of states have not even recognized actual innocence as a legal basis to vacate a conviction.
Get out.
No, really.
Wow.
Pennsylvania is one of them.
I don't understand that. How can you not vacate a conviction if somebody is innocent? I mean,
so I want to be careful. I don't want to.
And I know that you've had interviews where you've been asked the difference between wrongful conviction and innocence. So maybe you should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's actually perfect. So let me jump into that, and then we'll try to swing back to your dismay at my last statement. But wrongful convictions are when we say under a state constitution or the federal constitution that there was a deprivation of the defendant's right to due process, i.e. something went wrong in that trial such that he or she did not get a fair trial. Like
the Brady violation.
The Brady violation, right. And let me say, it's not easy. It's not a standard that's easy to meet. And understandably so. I think historically it's important to know when we talk about our criminal justice system, we've got probably the best in the entire world. And when we get a conviction, there is that tendency to say we've got the best system in the world, and once we have the conviction, that's the end of it. And we don't necessarily want to be a society where our convictions aren't meaningful and it's just very easy to overturn them. We want them to mean something. So understanding all of that, it makes sense, and it's important for people to know that when you talk about a due process violation, as I said a second ago, it's not easy to prove. The record's got to establish it. The law's got to support it. And at the end of the day, a judge is going to have to say that whatever it was, that problem that led to the trial not being fair undermines our confidence in the jury's verdict or the judge's verdict. So it's tough. So take that into consideration now when I compare that with actually innocent. You could be guilty of a crime and you could get your conviction vacated based on a due process violation. Because when the vacating occurs, essentially what that does is it gives a prosecutor, the state, the Commonwealth, the right to retry them. And arguably, you should be able to go back and still get a conviction, but do it in a way that doesn't deprive the defendant of his right to due process. Make it fair. When you talk about actual innocence, obviously you're not talking about that scenario. You're talking about a situation where not only is it shown that there was a due process violation, the trial was unfair, but you're actually saying that there is evidence that says that it's not just that you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual committed the crime, but there's actual evidence that says that he's innocent of it. And to try to kind of wrap your brain around that, it's important to kind of analogize where if you have a trial, first trial ever, and a jury ultimately says not guilty, understand that not guilty doesn't mean innocent. What it means is that the state or the Commonwealth just has not met their burden of proof, which is to prove that that individual committed the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So when we're talking post-conviction and we're trying to say somebody is actually innocent, it's more than just saying he didn't get a fair trial.
How do you do that? How do you make what? So if somebody's not guilty, then the state hasn't met the bar. What do you have to do to prove somebody's innocent? Prove some other person did it, I guess.
It's very difficult, and I think courts throughout our country are grappling with that very question. In fact, the opinion that was handed down today in Texas, it's about a 100-page opinion, and the judge that wrote the majority says actual innocence, and she reaches that conclusion by using a standard of by clear and convincing evidence. So she's saying that the record established by clear and convincing evidence that Mr. Cheney did not commit the crime. Not just that we had lack of confidence in the jury's verdict, but that burden was met. A bunch of other judges wrote concurring opinions. In other words, they agreed with the ultimate outcome that Mr. Cheney was entitled to have his conviction vacated, but what they disagreed with is how do you prove actual innocence? And there's actually a couple of judges that said this is such a big deal that we ought to have a burden that is pretty darn tough to meet. And two of them, I think, and I'm still trying to digest all of the things that were said, but two of them said that that burden needs to be so high it needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt. I, of course, strongly disagree with that, because I think if you start saying that's the only way you can prove actual innocence, I think we're going to have a whole bunch of people that are actually innocent that never get that kind of relief, because I don't know how you get to beyond a reasonable doubt unless you are just looking at possibly the DNA exonerations, where you say the DNA not only excluded the defendant, but it actually told us who the perpetrator was, so therefore we could prosecute them.
So let me get a little personal on this now. Have you met Mark Cheney? I have, yes. Yeah. And when will he get out of jail?
So he's been out, and I don't want to just say that because I want to explain it. This is another one of those areas where the law of the jurisdiction is so different and it affects how these cases are handled. In Texas, because the high court ultimately has to make this decision, there is a law on the books that allows a defendant to get out of prison on bond after the trial court grants the relief. And they are on bond under the conditions as if they're still charged with the murder until the high court makes its mind up. So
that's great, though. I was thinking that he had to wait 2 years in jail, so I'm really glad to hear that.
Right. Now, in other jurisdictions, they don't have that, or if they do have it, it's such a hard or high hurdle to overcome that you do have people that sit in jail or prison for a long time waiting for the ultimate fact finder, so to speak, to actually bless the decision and say this person is actually innocent.
So how will this change his life, this decision today?
It'll change it dramatically. And this is, forgive me for doing this because I'm not so sure your audience wants to hear all the intricate details of Texas law. But one thing that is fascinating is Texas, which also takes me back to the very beginning of my comments about I don't think criminal justice reform is necessarily partisan. Texas is a pretty conservative state, but Texas has done a whole lot in terms of legislating reforms to help identify and remedy wrongful convictions. And what I'm getting to now for purposes of Mr. Cheney is huge, and that is Texas passed a compensation statute. So if Mr. Cheney chooses to apply for compensation under that law, he will receive quite a bit of money for the time that he spent in prison now that he's been declared actually innocent.
Wow.
A lot of states don't have that, but Texas do. And so the short answer to your question is Mr. Cheney's life will be remarkably different now because now he is not under any bond conditions as a person who's accused of murder. Instead, now he is an exonerated individual who's entitled to be compensated for 25 years spent in prison.
And also, if you're convicted of a crime, it's a lot harder to get a job. So now he'll be an innocent man.
Absolutely.
And maybe a sympathetic one who people might want to hire.
I will tell you, because I was lucky enough to get to meet Mr. Cheney on multiple occasions. One was during my investigation of the case, and I'll tell you he was a sympathetic man, even with the consequences that he was having to live with the murder conviction to start with, and then the murder case pending until the court ruled today. And I think he certainly has been able to work while he's been on bond, but life has been way more difficult than it needed to be as we waited for the court to make its decision.
How old is he?
He was probably, I have to do the math a little bit because this has taken a while. I'm guessing he's somewhere between 60 and 65 now. I want to say he was close to 60 or late 50s when he was released on bond, which was several years ago.
Boy, it's an incredible story. Congratulations again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So you're now working to, part of your job is to prevent that kind of thing from happening, right?
Absolutely.
How does that work?
That is, that's a difficult question to just answer in a line or two, because a lot of debate is going on about how do you take the lessons we've learned from the wrongful convictions and use those so as to prevent them from reoccurring. And from my vantage point in what I do, I take that very seriously. And I think a lot of where you have to start is you have to try to change the culture in prosecutors' offices, to try to kind of use a different yardstick in terms of how we measure whether or not a prosecutor is successful or not. I'll say, for example, in Texas, one of the criticisms of prosecutors for many years was prosecutors received promotions and raises based on how many convictions they obtained and how long of sentences they were able to get from juries or judges. And so that kind of culture, of course, did not lend itself to really being mindful of maybe we got it wrong and maybe we need to undo it. So I use that to kind of illustrate the starting point is change the culture. Understand that we define success, or we should define success very differently.
How instead of number of convictions and length of sentences, how would you define success in a progressive DA's office?
So I'll answer it in regard to progressive, but I think my answer would apply to offices that maybe wouldn't call themselves progressive. And
a just office.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what it's about. I think success is not about convictions and sentences. It's about doing justice, and it's about.
But wait. So if success is about doing justice, how would you characterize these ones that based on a number of convictions and length of sentences?
I don't think that it's mutually exclusive, so don't get me wrong. I think sometimes you just have to be careful that when you are measuring with convictions and sentences, you're not necessarily also understanding that sometimes doing justice is not prosecuting a case if you've got questions about it. Sometimes doing justice is saying, I'm going to open up my file to the defendant to make sure that I am not intentionally or unintentionally holding back Brady material, and understand that sometimes when you do that, you know what it may mean? It may mean that the jury doesn't convict. I think if you get an idea of what I'm trying to say.
Would some prosecutors consider that to be a bad strategy or something that would weaken their ability to aggressively prosecute a case?
Sure. Absolutely. I think that that's the way it's been, and I think that there are prosecutors out there that still think that way.
I call the show the Bottom Up Show, and I think part of being bottom up is transparency and keeping things open, and that's what you're describing there.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you that let's just focus on the transparency and the open file. That's one of those areas that I think is at the top of my list when I think about reforming the criminal justice system and trying to do what we can, learn from the lessons of the past to make sure that we're not repeating them. And our hopes are that we will get there here in Philadelphia.
What are your goals? Do you have like a priority list of goals on how you'd like to change the system there to make it more just?
Sure, and I, as well as probably a lot of your audience, that Larry Krassner has done a whole lot. I'm going to give you the answer about what Larry Krassner wants to do in my world, which is the Conviction, Integrity, and Special Investigations Unit.
All right, but first a brief show ID, okay? It's the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, and we're going to pause for a moment. My guest is Patricia Cummings. She's an attorney with the Philadelphia DA's office. She supervises the Conviction, Integrity, and Special Investigations Unit within the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. Now you're going to tell us about the priorities of Krassner, right?
Right. So, and I'm telling you about Mr. Krassner's priorities in regard to my unit. So I want to be very clear with that. And that is, as I said at the outset, make it a real unit who's willing to look at more than just a handful of cases. Pay attention when folks are, whether it's through a lawyer or a pro se defendant, saying something went wrong in this case, will you take a look at it? So you've got to have the willingness to open it up. In addition to that, his commitment is to do the work in such a way that we open it up, we investigate it, and that we are not afraid to say when we think we've gotten it wrong. Doing that, I think, to achieve the optimal results in this particular line of work is to try to be as collaborative as you can, which is kind of interesting because it's very different than what we normally think of in terms of how the criminal justice system works.
Collaborative with the
defendant, the defense, and
police.
Pardon me?
The police.
The police, as much as that's possible.
Now, I do recall that when you gave your talk at Arcadia at the Peace and Justice Studies Conference, you basically said that the police were very resistant to some of the changes that Krassner has been attempting to put into effect. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I'm glad to, but I also want to couch my answer in, I want to be very clear, I'm not so sure that it's just the police resistance. I think there's resistance, period. And I think that that's just kind of natural human behavior. When you go in and try to change a system that really hasn't significantly been changed, all of us kind of say, I don't like change. I don't.
The judges as well are also resistant?
I'm going to tell you, I think, that you're going to find resistance at every level of the criminal justice system. That's not to say that everybody is, but I think you're going to see it at every single level. And I don't think we should be surprised about that.
Okay.
I think that what we have to do is we have to try to be intelligent and reasonable in terms of our expectations, and we've got to figure out what's the best method to try to break down that resistance if it means coming up with more just outcomes. And that's indeed what we're trying to do with the work here under Larry's leadership.
Okay, so let's continue. You were talking about the priorities that Larry Krassner has for your unit in terms of how to make things more just.
Right. So the priorities are be willing to look at cases, be willing to investigate, and also be willing to look at things that maybe some folks weren't looking at before. When I first started working for Larry in February, there was some discussion about, can we reach a point where we say we need to reconsider how we're doing sentencing? And I'll tell you that conversation is not just from my vantage point of conviction integrity, it's from an office-wide approach. And, a lot of that is coming from what we're learning from science, what we're learning from various different studies that have been done. I think that, as a community, I'm going to say, from the perspective of Philadelphia, but then I'm going to open it up just to, as a country, the idea of long sentences and mass incarceration has not made us safer as a society. And so what Larry is trying to do office-wide is to say, let's not just jump on that bandwagon and say that that's the right thing to do. So in the context, and let me shift from the office-wide to just my unit, we said very early on, we ought to be willing to look at whether or not anything could be done with, say, for example, the folks that are in prison serving life without parole. So we're working on that. We're committed to that. We're looking very long and hard on an individual basis at cases where folks are applying for commutation. And let's say they've served 35 or 40 years of a life sentence. And when they were sentenced back in the day, in Pennsylvania, there was the hope that they might get commutation and get out. But for various reasons, one of them is politics. What we've seen in Pennsylvania over the last several decades is that's not been happening. And from kind of, looking at it microscopically from the vantage point of a prosecutor's office, I think we're also saying, do we really as prosecutors need to always say we're going to oppose those requests just based on the nature of the crime or the facts of the case? And I'll tell you, I think most offices throughout the country look at requests for commutation and parole according to that kind of lens. So Larry is committed to looking at that, going down that road, seeing whether or not we can do something within our ethical mandates and the law in Pennsylvania that will allow us to say, maybe that person who's served 40 years ought to be able to get out of prison.
And has that happened yet?
We're looking at cases, yes.
Okay.
Pardon
me. You're basically, from what you've described so far, your work is basically looking at cases that have already been tried.
Correct.
How about kind of a backwards feedback, where you look at the way things have been done to change the way they're doing things? Is that happening?
Absolutely. And that's a big component of conviction integrity work, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend all the time and resources trying to understand what went wrong and then not use that moving forward. A lot of times the crunch you kind of have with people doing the work is kind of how do you assign your time, right? It's almost like a triage, because a lot of units throughout the country don't have a lot of resources and manpower. And so when they look at, these are all the things we want to do, but we only have time to do one of them, which one are we going to choose? And I think understandably, they're going to choose, if somebody's been sitting in prison for 35 years and there is evidence to indicate that they're innocent, then what you're going to do is you're going to put your resources in that bucket and do what you can to get them out. The wonderful thing, another wonderful thing I will say about working for Larry, is he's given us the resources to not only spend a great deal of our time and energy on that first bucket, but we are also dealing with the other buckets as well. And those buckets would be, how do we contribute in efforts to change the culture in the office? How do we contribute to policy decisions, whether it is how to implement them or whether it's how to start from ground zero and write them. And in particular, I will say some of that is spending a great deal of time dealing with Brady issues, making sure that our prosecutors are trained and that they understand what their legal and ethical obligations are in regard to that. Going back to where you started with this question, making sure that we are getting information from the police department regarding misconduct that officers may have engaged in, so we turn that information over as part of our Brady Giglio obligation.
No, in the movies and television, that's often a problem, where somebody with some kind of a power or political motivation is keeping something back or holding back, and again, that's a Brady violation. Is that happen much in Philadelphia, in anywhere really? I mean, how real is that?
Well, I think it's real. I'm not about to try to quantify it for you in places that I don't have intimate knowledge of, but yeah, it's real. I mean, you spend any time in a law library looking at criminal cases that have been reversed, and quite a few criminal cases have been reversed for the state's failure to disclose favorable exculpatory evidence. And keep in mind, and actually I don't know that we've talked about this yet, so let me just kind of set the stage. When we talk about a prosecutor's Brady obligation, a prosecutor is responsible not for only turning over that information that they have that's in their file, but we're responsible for information the police may have. So we've got a very, very serious job to do in the sense of, yes, I can show you what I have, but I've got to make sure that I've got a relationship with my police officer, so I'm getting all the information they have, so then in turn I'm able to disclose that to the defendant. So
I've been involved and looked at government transparency in different areas, on spending and things like that. It would seem to me like there could be some laws passed that would basically require transparency so that the police records and the district attorney records would be accessible, maybe not only to the district attorney, but maybe to anybody. I don't know. I guess there's some privacy issues as well, but
yeah, you don't have to
look away from that.
So let me just say, you don't have to look very far in media reports to understand that those are issues that are being discussed and litigated all over the country. Everything from whether or not it's a lawsuit in New York where folks are trying to get access to the disciplinary files of police officers for the transparency reasons that you're referring to whether or not prosecutors should have to open up their entire file and have what we call open file discovery. I'll refer you, gave New York as one example for the police officer misconduct. On the other hand, you can look to California that recently passed a law that basically says if prosecutors are found to have intentionally failed to disclose Brady information, not only is it an ethical problem, but it's actually a criminal offense.
Good. Good.
And then you look to Texas and you see what Texas has done. You and I talked about this when we were on the phone earlier today. There's the Michael Morton case in Texas which was an exoneration where a man was released after serving 25 years in prison. His case had such a huge impact on Texas that the legislature in Texas, for the first time in 50 years, amended their discovery rules and actually mandates now that prosecutors open up their files to defense to make sure, or at least try to minimize, Brady violations in the future.
And you were involved in that case, right?
Right. Michael was my client.
Yeah. Cool. So your legal work led to legislation that made for more justice. That's fabulous.
I was very lucky. I actually got to work at the Capitol and helped write the legislation that ultimately got passed. So it was pretty amazing.
So you talked about changing the culture and policy decisions. Can you talk a little bit more about what's the culture and what needs to be changed within the culture?
Oh, I think we've talked about some of that already, and that is just, defining what it means to be a successful prosecutor. I think it also...
Okay, yeah, you talked about the other way, but we really didn't, I don't think you really talked about what's the better way of doing it.
I think it is to set up an environment where we start kind of using science to help us inform our decision making. And that's not something that we've done in the criminal justice world. It's funny to say that, given the fact that I said Mr. Cheney was convicted on bite mark science back in the 80s. That's very different than what I'm talking about right now. When I say we have not made decisions in the criminal justice world about science, we've made them more from an emotional fear type area. In other words, so often what we have done is we've said, that if a certain crime was committed, the only way to adequately deal with that crime is to take the defendant off the street and lock him up for a long period of time. And that by doing that, we not only achieve the specific deterrence of making that individual not be able to commit crimes, but we really believe that we were going to be successful in generally deterring others. Now we are seeing that the long prison sentences and locking everybody up is not actually making our communities safer. So I think to the extent that you change the culture in the prosecutor's office to say, let's make informed decisions from that standpoint, as opposed to from the fear, which is, and I've been a prosecutor, this is the third time in my life, and so I know this intimately. So often prosecutors are making decisions because they say, I don't want to be the one to say that this person maybe should get probation or maybe their case should be dismissed because I don't want to hear about it in the news next week if he goes out and harms somebody. So we have historically, and we continue to be in a lot of areas throughout our country, driven by that, as opposed to being willing to look at it and say, what does the science tell us? What is the best use of our money? And this has been a big deal.
Is there enough funding for this kind of science?
That's a real broad question. I'm not sure I know how to answer it. So I'll cheat a little bit and I'll answer it my way, which is I was reading an article in D Magazine, a Dallas publication, just yesterday. And they just recently elected a new district attorney who I'm very excited about because I think he's going to go in and do a lot of really good criminal justice reforms in Dallas. And he was talking in the context of resources and the ability to do things. And he said something that I've believed in for a while, which is so often people say, how can you do the conviction integrity work if your city or your county's not giving you a bunch of money? And he says, well, let's think about that for a minute. If we're being smart on how we prosecute crimes, and say, for example, we're not prosecuting the thousands of people for small amounts of marijuana, and we're not prosecuting the thousands of people for driving on a suspended license, maybe all the money we had for that could be shifted over to where we could use that money to do these other things that need to be done.
So that's almost like petty justice. These small prosecutions. Are they profitable? So they're not profitable. They cost the municipality or the state money.
Now that's a very difficult question because I think there's plenty of people out there that say oftentimes you have jurisdictions that actually prosecute small petty crimes because they want the money from it. So you've got to be real careful to kind of define, things that fit into that category.
And that's horrible.
It's horrible, but you also have another important category to be cognizant of, and that is where you're putting people in jail and sending them through the court system for a small amount of marijuana. And when you do the math on that, the cost, the actual out-of-pocket cost for that, not to mention the cost to society, is far greater than what I think most Americans, when you look at the numbers now, just in the category of beliefs on marijuana, most Americans wouldn't support that.
And that's something that's changed in Philadelphia under Krassner.
Yes, it has.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got a wrap. Thank you so much for being on the show. This has been the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. My guest for the show has been Patricia Cummings. She's the Supervisor of Conviction Integrity and Special Investigations at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Unit. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rob. Happy holidays.